The last thing I expected to do on Thanksgiving was end up in an emergency room with a breathing tube down my throat. But that's what happens when the people who are supposed to love you decide convenience is worth more than your life. My mother called me 2 weeks before the holiday with that particular sweetness in her voice she only uses when she needs something. "Claire, sweetheart, we'd love to have you home this year. Your sister's been asking about you." That was the first sign I should have kept driving straight through Nashville and not stopped until I hit the Gulf Coast. My sister asking about me was the equivalent of a smoke alarm going off. It didn't mean she was glad to see you. It meant something was already burning. I had been living in Charlotte for 3 years, working as a senior accountant at a mid-size firm, building a life that was entirely my own. My apartment had a view of the city lights. I had a best friend named Dana who brought me coffee when my deadlines ran long and remembered my birthday without Facebook reminders. I had a routine and peace and mornings that didn't start with someone making me feel like a supporting character in my own story. Going back to my parents' house in Clarksville always felt like stepping into a costume that no longer fit. I knew the moment I walked through that door, I would stop being the person I'd spent 3 years becoming and turn back into the younger daughter, the one who could never quite measure up no matter how much she tried. My sister Rachel had been the family's centerpiece from the moment she drew her first breath. 4 years older than me, effortlessly charming, the kind of woman who walked into a room and rearranged it around herself without anyone noticing. She was the one my parents called when they had good news. She was the one my dad bragged about at the hardware store. She had given them 2 grandchildren, a son-in-law who worked in real estate, and the particular satisfaction that comes from a daughter who stayed close to home and confirmed every hope they'd had for her. I had left. That was my sin, and no professional achievement, no promotion, no raise had ever fully absolved me of it. The allergy situation had been in the family for as long as I could remember. I was diagnosed with a severe tree nut allergy at 7 years old, after my throat swelled shut at a neighbor's birthday party. The kind of allergy that isn't a preference or a mild inconvenience. The kind that means I carry an EpiPen in my purse the way other people carry lip balm. My parents knew. My sister knew. Every single person in that family had been reminded, gently and not so gently, every holiday for over 2 decades. My mother had adjusted recipes. My dad learned to read labels. Even my brother-in-law knew to ask at restaurants. Rachel knew best of all. We had grown up together. She had been sitting in the living room the afternoon. My mother rushed me to the ER with an anaphylactic reaction when I was 9. She had seen what it looked like. She had watched the nurses put the IV in my small arm. She had no excuse for forgetting. The drive to Clarksville took just under 4 hours. I listened to a podcast about financial crime the whole way, which in hindsight was a more fitting soundtrack than I realized. My friend Dana had texted me before I left. "You sure about this?" I told her I was fine. I told myself the same thing another 3 times before I pulled into the driveway. The house looked the same as always, a brick colonial with a wreath on the door, and my mother's potted mums still alive on the porch, which was frankly impressive given how late in November it was. My dad met me at the door with a half hug, the kind that communicates acknowledgement without warmth. "There she is," he said, like I was a slightly late Amazon package. My mother came from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel, her smile wide and practiced. "Claire, you look thin. Are you eating?" That was her version of hello. Rachel was in the living room with her kids, who were old enough now to be uninterested in an aunt they saw twice a year. She stood up when I came in, opened her arms, and gave me one of those full contact hugs that lasted exactly long enough to feel genuine and not a second more. "You came," she said, which struck me as an odd thing to say. "Not so good to see you. Not I missed you. Just you came, like my attendance had been in question, and the outcome remained to be seen." The kitchen smelled like everything good that had ever existed. Roasted turkey, sweet potato casserole, butter rolls browning in the oven. My mother had been cooking since the previous night, and the table was set with the formal china she only brought out twice a year. I stood in the doorway for a moment and let myself believe just for a second that maybe this year would be different. It never is. You know that going in. But you still hope. The afternoon moved the way family holidays tend to move. Conversations that stay carefully on the surface, compliments directed at the children, my dad holding court about local politics while my brother-in-law nodded at appropriate intervals. Rachel steered every mention of my career into a brief pause, and then a redirect to something about her daughter's school play or her husband's latest property closing. I stopped counting how many times it happened. I had been talking to my dad's oldest friend, a man named Gerald who had known me since I was in diapers, about the forensic accounting work my firm had been doing for a regional bank, when Rachel appeared at my elbow with a smile and a glass of sparkling cider. "Mom says dinner is ready," she said. "Gerald, you have to try the sweet potatoes. She used a new recipe." She guided me toward the dining room with one hand briefly at my back, and I noticed as I moved past the kitchen that she was the last one out, pausing near the counter for just a moment longer than she needed to. I didn't think anything of it. I should have. The table was full, the way it only gets twice a year. Turkey in the center, green beans, cornbread, sweet potato casserole, 2 kinds of pie already waiting on the sideboard. My mother had made a separate dish of green bean almondine for the rest of the family, and a plain version for me, as she always did. I'd eaten it every Thanksgiving of my adult life. It was labeled with a sticky note in her handwriting. "Claire, no nuts." My brother-in-law said grace. My dad carved the turkey. The kids argued over who got the first roll. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. I had been eating for about 15 minutes when I noticed the tingling. It starts at the back of the tongue first, a strange warmth that doesn't belong there. Then it spreads to the lips. I have had enough reactions in my life to recognize what my body is telling me. I put my fork down. Across the table, Rachel was laughing at something her husband said. She didn't look at me. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice level. "Did you change the recipe for the green beans?" She looked up. "I use the same thing I always do, sweetheart. Why?" The tingling was moving into my throat now. "I need my EpiPen," I said. "Where's my bag?" The table went quiet. My mother stood up. "Claire, you're probably just... I need it now." My voice came out sharper than I intended, and I was already pushing back from the table, my chest tightening in that unmistakable way. My purse was in the front closet where I'd hung my coat. The distance between me and it felt longer than it had any right to be. What happened next unfolded in pieces. I made it to the hallway before my knees became uncertain. I found my bag. I got the EpiPen out. I have done this before, once in college, once in my mid-20s at a work event, so my hands know what to do even when my brain is starting to lag behind. I jabbed my thigh through my slacks and held it. The medication hit my system with that familiar electric clarity. Gerald had followed me into the hallway. He took one look at my face and pulled out his phone. His son was a paramedic who worked out of the station 3 miles away. He called him directly. "Marcus," he said into the phone. And I heard the word anaphylaxis and an address, and then I was focused on breathing and not much else. Marcus arrived in his personal car 7 minutes later, still in his work clothes because he had just come off a shift. He walked in with a bag over his shoulder and the kind of calm that comes from having handled genuine emergencies long enough to stop fearing them. He checked my airway, my pulse, my oxygen saturation on a small clip device he pulled from his pocket. He looked at me and said, "EpiPen was the right call. You did good. But we're going to the ER." My mother was behind him in the hallway. "Is that necessary?" "She looks better already." Marcus turned around slowly. He was a big man, quiet in the way that people who don't need to prove anything tend to be. Her throat is still partially compromised, and the epinephrine is going to start wearing off. "Yes, it's necessary." "She's always been sensitive," my mother said to the hallway wall rather than to Marcus or to me. "Ever since she was little, she overreacts to things." Something moved across Marcus's face that was not quite anger and not quite disbelief. He turned back to me and said, "Can you walk to my car?" "Yes," I said. Rachel appeared at the end of the hallway, her arms crossed, her expression doing that particular thing it does when she is composing the version of events she will tell later. She ate the plain green beans, she said to no one specifically. The ones Mom made for her. "I don't understand how this happened." Marcus was writing something in a small notebook. He didn't look up. "That's an interesting thing to say," he said. "I don't remember much of the drive." Marcus kept talking to me, not in an alarmed way, just steady conversation to keep me present and to monitor my speech for any worsening. He asked me about my work, about Charlotte, about what I was listening to on the way down. At the hospital, he walked me directly into triage and spoke to the nurses with the authority of someone they recognized, because they did recognize him. He worked this ER 3 days a week. The attending physician was a woman who asked me the same questions in a different order from the paramedics and got the same answers. They ran blood work. They gave me IV antihistamines and monitored me for the next 2 hours while the medication continued to work. Marcus sat in the waiting area and did not leave. My parents arrived 20 minutes after I did. My mother wanted to come back to the treatment area, and the nurse told her I could only have one person at a time. I asked for Marcus. The look on her face when he came through the door instead of her was something I would have felt guilty about once. That version of me felt further away now. Do you want to know what I think happened? Marcus asked, sitting in the chair beside my bed. Tell me. The ER admitted you with anaphylaxis consistent with tree nut exposure. Your blood work is going to confirm it. He paused. I went back and looked at your plate before we left. The green beans had almond slivers mixed in. Not obvious ones, small, chopped up fine. The kind that don't look like what they are unless you know to look. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment. I took pictures, he said, before anyone cleared the table. I turned my head to look at him. I've been doing this job long enough to know what an accident looks like, he said. And I know what deliberate looks like. I said nothing. I didn't need to. We had both grown up watching what this family did and didn't do, and we both knew my sister had been the only one near that dish between my mother carrying it from the stove to the table and me sitting down to eat. The blood work came back, confirming cashew exposure. Not almond, not walnut, cashew. My mother had used almond extract in the sweet potato casserole, nowhere near my green beans, nowhere near my plate. The source was specific. I had eaten nothing else that could have carried it. The ER physician noted the cashew exposure in my chart, with the same professional neutrality doctors use for everything. She also noted that the exposure appeared inconsistent with accidental cross-contamination, given the severity of the reaction and the deliberateness of the amount required to cause it. Marcus called someone he knew at the county sheriff's office. Not dramatically, not as a threat, just a quiet conversation on a phone in the hospital parking lot. He came back in and sat beside me again. They're sending a detective, he said, to ask some questions. You can decide how much you want to say. All of it, I said. My parents were in the waiting room by then, along with my sister and her husband, who had brought the kids and was now dealing with 2 overtired children in plastic chairs. My mother had apparently told 3 different nurses that I had a tendency to exaggerate, and that this was probably not as serious as it looked. The nurse at the desk, to her credit, had documented each instance of that statement. Detective Okafor arrived an hour later with a quiet manner and a legal pad. She sat beside my bed and asked me to describe the day from the beginning. I did. I told her about the drive, the house, the table, the labeled dish, the 15 minutes before the reaction, the tingling, the timing. I told her about Rachel pausing near the counter. I told her about the look on my sister's face in the hallway. I told her what Marcus had found on my plate. Marcus came in and showed her the photographs on his phone. He described exactly what he had seen, using the language of his training. She wrote everything down without expression. When she left to speak with my family, Marcus sat back down. You know she's going to deny it, he said. I know. You also know the evidence is going to make that very difficult. I looked at the IV drip in my arm and thought about the 7-year-old version of me in a hospital room, very much like this one, my mother rubbing my hand and telling me the nurses were going to take care of me. There had been a time when I believed that my family would always protect me from things that could hurt me. That belief had been expiring slowly for years. Tonight it was fully gone. The detective spoke to Rachel for 45 minutes. I know this because Marcus timed it in the waiting room. When she came back to my room, she told me that my sister had said she had no idea how cashews could have gotten into my food, that she hadn't touched the green bean dish, and that this seemed like a terrible accident. She also told me that my sister's husband had mentioned, unprompted, that I had seemed stressed and distracted at dinner. She said it in a tone that communicated she found that detail interesting. We'll be requesting surveillance of the scene, she told me. Your parents' home has a security camera system. Did you know that? I didn't. Installed 6 months ago, she said. Your father mentioned it when I introduced myself. He seemed to forget it covered the kitchen. I was discharged the following morning with a prescription, follow-up instructions, and a file number from the county sheriff's office that made the whole thing real in a way that the hospital bracelet alone had not quite managed. Marcus drove me to a hotel 3 miles from my parents' house. I was not going back to that home. My mother called 4 times before noon. My father called twice. Rachel did not call. I answered none of them. Dana drove down from Charlotte that afternoon without being asked, arriving at my hotel room with a bag of food she had assembled from a grocery store 40 minutes away, including every single thing she knew I could safely eat. She sat on the edge of my bed and didn't say anything for a while, which was exactly right. What happens now? she finally asked. Now we wait for the camera footage, I said. The footage was reviewed within 72 hours. Marcus called me when Detective Okafor called him. The kitchen camera had captured 17 seconds that were apparently enough. Rachel standing at the counter while everyone else was already seated. Something small in her hand. Her fingers moving quickly over my labeled green bean dish, her head coming up to check that no one was watching. Then she walked to the table and sat down like nothing had happened. The detective described it to me in neutral language. I listened and said thank you, and hung up and sat very still for a long time. I thought about all the Thanksgivings and Christmases and Easter Sundays when I had sat at that table and quietly accepted the smaller portion of attention, the redirected compliments, the moments where my accomplishments were heard and then set aside like furniture that didn't quite match the room. I thought about being 12 years old and watching Rachel receive a car on her 16th birthday while being told that by the time I turned 16, things might be different financially, and how I had not said a word because I had already understood by then that making noise would only cost me more than the silence did. I thought about 3 years of building a life in Charlotte that had nothing to do with them, and how even that had never quite felt like enough distance. I also thought about the look on my sister's face in the hallway. Not guilt, not fear. That particular brand of certainty that belongs to people who have spent their entire lives believing the rules don't apply to them, because for most of that time, they were right. The charges came down 6 weeks later. Assault causing bodily harm and criminal reckless endangerment. My attorney, a woman I found through a colleague and who had a manner like a very precise blade, filed civil suit simultaneously for medical expenses, pain and suffering, and negligent endangerment. When I saw the number on the filing, I sat with it quietly for a full minute before signing. My parents issued a statement through Rachel's attorney, saying they were shocked and that this was a family matter that should be handled privately. I did not respond publicly. I let the criminal justice system respond on my behalf. The trial was the strangest 3 days of my life, and I have had some genuinely strange days. I sat in the front row in a gray blazer with my hair pulled back and watched my sister's attorney explain to a jury that this had been an accidental contamination from a shared kitchen environment. I watched the prosecutor place 17 seconds of security footage on a screen large enough for the back row to see clearly. I watched 3 of the 4 jurors who faced the screen when it began stop writing and just watch. When I testified, I told the truth in the same order I had told it to Detective Okafor. I did not elaborate. I did not cry, though I had expected to. I described what I experienced in my body with the same language I had used when I finally understood my own finances well enough to trace exactly where every dollar went. Precisely. Without drama, without leaving anything out. My sister's attorney tried twice to establish that I was known to be anxious and prone to catastrophizing. My attorney objected once, and the judge sustained it before she could finish the second attempt. The verdict came back on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Guilty on both counts. Rachel was sentenced to 18 months, with the possibility of early release after 12 pending behavior. She looked at the table when the judge read it. She did not look at me. My parents sat 2 rows behind her. My father stared straight ahead. My mother pressed a tissue to the corner of her eye. I noticed she did not look at me either. Outside the courthouse, Marcus was waiting on the steps. He had testified earlier in the proceedings and had driven down from Clarksville specifically for the verdict. He handed me a coffee from the place across the street without saying anything. We stood there for a minute watching the traffic move on the street below. "You're going to get calls," he said. "I know. Extended family, mutual friends. People with opinions about what you should have done differently. I've already gotten 2. He looked at me sideways. And I didn't answer them, I said. He nodded. That was the right answer, and we both knew it. The civil case settled 8 months later for a figure my attorney described as favorable, which I understood to mean more than I had asked for and less than she had argued for, which placed it exactly in the range she had privately predicted. The settlement included full coverage of my medical expenses, lost income from the 3 days I had been unable to work following the hospitalization, and additional damages that I put directly into a savings account I did not touch for a year. What I did not do was issue a statement, give an interview, or post anything about it. Some people in the town where my parents lived formed opinions anyway. I heard about them secondhand, through my father's cousin who sent me a text I never replied to, and through a social media comment Dana showed me and then took away before I read it twice. The world is full of people who would have handled things differently. Most of them have never been the person lying on a hospital gurney, wondering how the food their family made for them was the thing that nearly killed them. My parents moved to a smaller house in the spring, closer to my brother-in-law's parents, who had apparently become their primary social support. We had spoken once in the 8 months since the trial, a 15-minute phone call initiated by my mother, in which she told me she hoped I knew how much pain this had caused the family. I listened until she finished. Then I told her that I was going to take care of myself. I said it without malice, which surprised me. I had expected anger, but what came out was something quieter and more final. I hung up and stood in my kitchen in Charlotte for a moment, looking at the city through my window. Then I made dinner and called Dana, and we talked for an hour about a show she was watching, and a trip she was planning, and a new client I had landed who was a regional nonprofit with complicated books and more heart than organizational sense. The conversation was ordinary and warm and mine. I still carry the EpiPen, I probably always will, but I carry it differently now, not as a reminder of what can be taken from me without warning, but as a reminder of the 7-year-old girl who had already learned that her body's alarm system was reliable, even when the people around her told her it wasn't. She knew something was wrong before she could name it. She always did. So did I. Driving down that highway toward Clarksville with a podcast about financial crime, playing through my speakers, and a familiar weight settling in somewhere around the Tennessee state line. I should have trusted that weight. I will not make that mistake again. The week after the settlement finalized, I drove to Clarksville one last time. Not to my parents' house. To Gerald's house, where Marcus was helping him replace a section of fence that had come down in a storm. I brought lunch from a deli I remembered from childhood, and we sat on the back porch in the cold November sun, and Gerald told stories about my dad from before I was born, from a time when things were simpler, or at least less known. Marcus said very little, which is mostly how he is. Before I left, I hugged Gerald for a long time. He patted my back in that way old men do, solid and sincere, like they're trying to pass something steady through their hands into you. Driving home, the highway was clear. My playlist ran through without interruption. By the time the Charlotte skyline came into view, the weight I had been carrying for the better part of a year had shifted into something I couldn't quite name. Not gone. Not forgotten. But no longer the loudest thing in the room. Some people talk about forgiveness like it's a door you walk through, and everything is different on the other side. I don't think it works that way, not for me. What I have is something simpler and harder to explain. I know exactly what happened. I have the medical records and the court documents and the 17 seconds of video footage to prove it. I know who the people in my family are when there are no consequences attached to who they choose to be. And I know who I am now, the person who walked out of that hospital and told the truth and kept telling it until the people who needed to hear it had no way left to look away. I am not waiting anymore. Not for acknowledgement, not for apology, not for the version of my family that existed only in the hope I carried for them. What I have instead is a life I built in a city that doesn't know my sister's name. I have a friend who drove 4 hours without being asked. I have a colleague who took photographs and made a phone call and sat outside a hospital waiting room for 2 hours on his day off, because that's the kind of person he is. I have my own table. I decide who sits at it. And every single person there knows exactly how to read a label.